And as the country and the political world was being hit with this shockwave about Eric Cantor last night, the initial explanatory narrative that sprung up to answer the obvious question, oh my God, what just happened? The initial explanatory narrative seems to have been bluntly wrong. That's why I think it's important to recognize that this was a really big shock. It's easy to get things wrong when you are shocked and confused. But now that we've had a day to actually look at and assess what happened, it seems like the initial explanation that everybody gave last night for why this happened, it just doesn't make sense. The rush to judgment that everybody made last night and in this morning's papers explaining what happened in Virginia, I think it was an easy mistake to make, because the candidate who beat Eric Cantor in Virginia last night, he did run a one-issue campaign against him. David Bratt's whole campaign against Eric Cantor was focused on immigration, that Eric Cantor wasn't tough enough on immigrants. Now, this wasn't a very closely watched race, right? Nobody anticipated that this was going to be something that was going to change the course of modern American politics in a huge way. Most of the national press, if they knew anything at all about Dave Bratt versus Eric Cantor, the only thing they knew was that Dave Bratt was running a campaign based on opposing immigration. So, right, the result when it came in, the one thing that everybody knew about the race, people just decided, okay, well, that must be what explained. That must be what explains what happened. That must explain it, right? Dave Bratt, the only thing we know about him is that he was running on immigration. Must be that it was immigration. Must be that Dave Bratt struck a chord with the residents of that district by being so anti-immigration. That district must be very anti-immigration. If only Eric Cantor was himself more anti-immigration, then he would have held on to his seat. That's how this race last night has been explained for the last 24 hours. But it is plainly and obviously not true. This polling was done by PPP in Eric Cantor's district in the 7th District of Virginia yesterday on primary day. It was a strongly Republican sample. Only 21% of the people they talked to were Democrats. 49% of the people they talked to were Republicans. And in this poll, they asked specifically about support for immigration reform. They asked the question in 3 different ways. They described the Senate immigration bill. They described it as bipartisan immigration reform legislation being debated in Washington. And then they asked if people liked it. In Eric Cantor's district, the number of respondents who strongly support or somewhat support that immigration reform proposal, which is basically the Senate plan, the number who strongly or somewhat support it is 72%. The number of people who somewhat or strongly oppose it is only 23%. It's 3 to 1. So they asked it in a different way. They asked it actually in slightly harsher terms, a more draconian, less friendly to immigrants version of immigration reform. That one also supported by huge majorities in Eric Cantor's district. In Eric Cantor's district, the people who support that version of immigration reform, 64% strongly or somewhat support. People strongly or somewhat opposed to it, 32%, 2 to 1. And then this blunt question to Eric Cantor's district, how important is it that the U.S. fix its immigration system this year? The number of people in Eric Cantor's district who say it's somewhat or very important that we fix the immigration system this year, 84%. Only 14% said it's not too important or not important at all. Eric Cantor's district did not vote against him because they hate immigration reform so much. Turns out when you ask them, they kind of love the idea of immigration reform. They love a whole bunch of different ideas about immigration reform. The more liberal the idea for immigration reform, in fact, the more they seem to like it, and by huge numbers. This is Public Policy Polling, which is a Democratic-leaning firm, but this does not appear to be an outlier. Last year, PPP and another group called Harper, which is a Republican firm, they also polled Virginia as a state on the overall issue of supporting immigration reform in the state of Virginia, and they found very similar numbers. Again, they asked about 2 different versions of immigration reform, and the support number in Virginia, the support numbers were 2 to 1, 3 to 1 in favor. 60% of Virginians said they would be more likely to vote for an elected official who supports immigration reform. Only 23% said they'd be less likely. So how do you make sense of these numbers? Contrary to all the Beltway noise, all the initial shock punditry last night, this does not appear to have been a frenzy of anti-immigration sentiment in Eric Cantor's home state and home district that drove what happened last night. Yes, immigration is what David Bratt ran on, but the polling says there's nothing magic about the issue of immigration that allowed him to win that seat. Maybe David Bratt could have run a one-issue campaign on the debt ceiling or the need for term limits or some spending issue or any other issue where he might have been able to come up with language to put Eric Cantor on the defensive. Maybe. I mean, if we're going to pick a magic decoder ring for understanding last night's results, it really can't be immigration. And maybe this is the magic decoder ring. Because this, in Eric Cantor's home district, from the latest polling conducted yesterday, this is Eric Cantor's home district approval rating. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that Representative Eric Cantor is doing? Approve, 30%, 30. Disapprove, 63%. With numbers that bad, there's no reason to think it had to be immigration, particularly because the immigration numbers suggest that it wasn't. I mean, anything where you could stake a claim and say, I'm not Eric Cantor, it kind of looks like I'm not Eric Cantor was going to win, even if I'm not Eric Cantor. Money, no outside support, and he really couldn't articulate answers to even the most basic policy questions, as Dave Bratt proved himself in his disastrous first round of television interviews today. I mean, in context, Eric Cantor losing his seat and losing it this way, it is a huge American political shock. And maybe it is the fact that it was so shocking that explains why the prevailing initial explanation of why it happened actually makes no sense.